we are introducing at the Foundation for Economic Growth and Development. So first of all, let me just welcome each one of you to have spared this time on a busy Friday evening, which I generally know is meant for the family, to join us on this webinar series. We are going to do this webinar series on almost a weekly basis, and most of the times it will be done on Friday evenings around this time itself, unless we have a dignitary from or an professor from somewhere in the US or another country and we have a different time slot. If you have suggestions for a better time slot, we'll be happy to accommodate that also. Just a brief introduction to the webinar series that we are starting. First of all, the Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare is a policy-oriented think tank. In this think tank, our objective is very plain and clear. We aim at research-based policy recommendation for the government and public sector institutions. So we are focused on policy. The issues that we want to focus on, or we have been focusing on, is the monetary and fiscal policy, socioeconomic indicators, poverty, malnutrition, unemployment, health, agriculture, and geopolitics. So these are the major areas on which we are focused. We would now like to introduce in this very scheme of things the webinar series, and today is the first webinar in our public policy endeavor to do informed policy recommendation. To kickstart our webinar series, we have our chairman, Dr. Arvind Virmani, the chairman of Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare, as well as the former chief economic advisor, Government of India, Ministry of Finance, as well as the executive director at the IMF. Highly experienced economist, very well respected in India and globally. He is kickstarting our webinar series. The recording will be done, and this recording will be available on our website. The focus of our webinar series will be policy-oriented research and research-oriented policy advice. And this is the perfect example that you will see in Dr. Virmani's presentation today. The scheme of things that we have in mind, 30 to 40 minutes of the discussion by the speaker, and then 15 to 20 minutes of question answer sessions. In case the question answers are very interesting, we may extend it by another 15-20 minutes. However, all recordings will be available if anybody wants to use it later for students or for educational purposes. You will find that our website will be live and giving so much of information on the issues that we work on, which we have just discussed. With this, I know everybody is keen and waiting to hear Dr. Virmani speak on this most important topic on the post-pandemic Indian economy. It's a burning topic and everybody wants to know where are we heading for, and who else could be better than Dr. Virmani to guide us on this special discussion. On to you, Dr. Virmani, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So, welcome to this first talk in our series, ladies and gentlemen. What I'm going to do is give an idea, a kind of an overview. I'll try to stick to 30 minutes because I hope we can have a discussion, in the question and answer sessions, particularly we can cover various aspects. So let me start with straight away. So, this pandemic is a once in a century event. I think what we can compare it, it's a global event like the Great Depression or the World War II. And the macroeconomics of pandemic, however, are quite unique. I mean, they directly be compared either with the Great Depression or the World War II. I just use those as examples of once in a century events. So why is that? Because the pandemic, they are both, it's a combination of supply and demand shocks. There are international supply chain effects, and in some sense, it varies. Even these relative importance of supply and demand shock has varied over time. Of course, there are international supply chain shocks, which we know because the pandemic originated in China and the immediate disruptions of those supply chains. But it also is accompanied by domestic uncertainty, partly because of in every country, not just India, because of the coronavirus treatment and immunity issues which have arisen, and also because of the lockdown and the different ways in which the different time it's been imposed, different lifting. So if one was to summarize this macroeconomic effects, it basically has resulted in a fragmented economy, both in a spatial and a sectoral sense. And implication of that is that the kind of general aggregate monetary policy approaches that we are used to thinking of don't work. One has to get much deeper into the details and use directed fiscal and monetary policy. Our research has, and there are references at the end of the talk, basically the lockdown was imposed and it exempted these items, the essential goods. What we estimate is that the essential goods, which were estimated, were approximately 40% of GDP and 50% of employment. These included, the sectors which were included was government administration. And what I will show you, and let me explain, that it says GDP Q1 FY21 over FY20. This means the ratio of the Q1 GDP in FY21 divided by the Q1 GDP in FY20. It's an indication of the severity of the effect that even in essential commodities, which were completely exempt from the lockdown, only 90% of government was operating if you compare it with last year. Hello, I can hear somebody, please mute. And the food economy, what we see, and the details I gave government administration from GDP, the rest of them are from IIP, same type of ratios. So what we see in the food, which was also completely exempt in theory, we find that in April it was at 75% of previous April levels, and then it shot up 1.3. And then in June it was around at 1 level. So roughly, this shows that the exemption worked pretty effectively in the food sector. If you take beverages, this was more complicated. The same ratios are 0.3, 0.7, and 0.75. That means in the beginning it didn't work. Why? Because it was very, somebody said aerated drinks like Coke and all are not exempt. Alcohol was not exempt. Then some of these things were brought in. So because of this confusion, the beverage part of it did not function. It didn't function effectively as an exempt. In pharmaceuticals, of course, there was an adjustment problem because initially people said masks should be banned, should not be banned. There was some confusion, but you can see pharmaceutical was essential. Basically, the exemption worked. In the beginning, it was only half, and then it was equal, and then much more. So in that sense, the exemption worked here. Similarly, electricity 0.77, 0.85, 0.9, pretty high levels because this was exempt. Similarly, refined petrol products like transport needed diesel and petrol. And you can see the numbers 0.7, 0.76, 86, high numbers, relatively high numbers was functioning. Similarly, the financial service sector at close to 1 at 0.90, 0.95 ratio. And then communication broadcasting, unfortunately, we don't have that separate, but that also was part of the exempt sectors. Now, what was the effect? Remember what I said in the introduction? So what we have is that this is the exempted part of the economy where we can say roughly the supply was functioning and there was an equal demand. The supply was being produced and bought up. So balance. There is no imbalance here. That's the point I'm making, because this is the part of the economy was functioning. Supply was equal to demand. No scope for any policy of fiscal policy here. Full employment, because by and large people were employed. They were producing and selling. But they could only consume because this, remember, it constituted 40% of the economy. So 60% of income they couldn't. Normally they would have bought so-called non-essential goods. All that was being saved. So saving rate in this part of the economy was much higher. Next, lockdown sectors, those which were shut. What we called in our research contract services, roughly this constitutes 10% of GDP and 10% of jobs. It's a relatively small sector if you look at it in this broad perspective. So out of 60%, 10 was this. Sorry, 60% GDP. Now, what was in here? Trade, hotels, restaurants, transport, you're all familiar with. Unfortunately, again, in the GDP, this segment also includes telecom and media, which was exempt. But you can get a rough idea that the economy here was functioning at 0.5, roughly half of the previous year's level, 0.53, that number. So this was mostly, but some of the trade of it, some of the transport was still doing trade and transport in essential commodities. Remember that 40% is functioning, and in theory, the transport of goods and the sale was permitted. So some of that was happening. But this is a very mixed up sector, so we don't have, but just to give you an idea. And also then e-commerce was allowed. So some of that was happening through e-commerce. Other services in the GDP category, they are educational, personal NGOs. But I just want to mention one interesting fact about the generally hospitality, entertainment, tourism was all shut. But the interesting thing here is that this is a large user of food and beverages. So indirectly, even though food and beverage is exempt, was an exempt sector, it was actually being harmed by this indirect effect. So there's a kind of an interesting sidelight to this. Of course, when we come to what can be done about it, the problem is that the coronavirus contagion is very high in public indoor spaces. I'll have a little more to say to it because it's very vital to understand this going forward. If the economy is going to, this part of the economy particularly, is going to recover quickly. Why? Because there were genuine fears after lockdown. In the beginning, we didn't know the full dimension. We knew a little bit about hand washing, etc. But now we know, and I will say something about it because it's very important. However, as far as fiscal policy was concerned, it will have little effect on this because they are lockdown sectors. And to restore confidence, so it's not a demand problem, because without restoring confidence through public health measures, it is not going to affect. There's no effect on fiscal expenditure measures on this. Why and what do we need to do of public measures? The new thing we know now with increasing amount of scientific evidence is that ventilation is very important. And if you don't have ventilated rooms, for example, if you have AC halls, whether it's for marriage parties, whatever, if you have AC rooms, then you must install UV filters. Otherwise, it's going to be very dangerous for everybody who goes to this. This applies to seminar halls and everything where you have a closed space which is not well ventilated and where AC air is recirculated. So the virus gets recirculated. You need UV filters, and even in smaller places where you have shops which are crowded, you will need to put, they have now made ultraviolet lights which can be fixed on the roof and filter out this virus. So we are going to need this if this stuff is going to recover. So, thing to be particularly wary of is bars. Why? And party room, because by definition, you can't wear a mask because you're eating or drinking And then if you are talking to people, if you are in a bar or a party, you're going there to talk to people, that's the deadliest place. It's direct transfer. It's happening. And we have seen that all across the world, wherever bars have been opened, there's a flare up in COVID and then they shut them down. So better to be prepared from before. And public bathroom. Why? Because there were earlier research 3 months ago which showed that coronavirus was found in the sewage. Okay. So the toilet is the worst place for an infected person, goes to toilet, then it gets thrown into the air. So anybody else using a public toilet is dangerous. So whether we are the public, whether it's government, whether it's employees, employers, we all have to understand this problem. That's why I've spent this little bit of extra time on this, though it's not economics, but it's very important for economic recovery. Okay, now the main part of the lockdown lifted in June and so on. This rest of the economy is about 50, consists of construction, manufacturing and mining, and it constitutes about 50% of the GDP, but less than that of jobs. So there are less jobs in this rest of the economy and more jobs in the essential commodity sector, which was always functioning. So the problem of jobs was actually less than many people kind of created this atmosphere in TV and all. Now construction, here it's the same thing, it's the ratio I told you, Q. So construction clearly, because the whole thing was shut down, it was functioning at half in Q1. Manufacturing was a little better, it was at around 0.6. So the production, the GDP, this is the ratio of Q1 GDP in current year to last year. So that shows at lower levels. Remember the earlier thing I showed you was functioning at 65, 70, 85, 90 levels because those were exempt. And this is whole of Q1 because the lockdown was strict till about middle of May, then it started gradually lifting. So you see some of that effect here. Mining much higher because it's out there in the rural areas. Probably there was not enough monitoring or enough restrictions because it's hard to impose a mine somewhere in the outback and allied services. We don't have an exact number because again, there's a mix of trade, transport, real estate, etc. Now, what about the macroeconomics? That's the important point here. So here, remember, this is all when the lockdown existed, it's shut down. There is zero employment, wages, and income because there's no activity. Okay, that implies that there's zero supply and zero demand. In this sector also, no scope for fiscal policy during the lockdown. This is a very important point which I hope people understand because that's one thing you should take away from this because a lot of the so-called experts in India and abroad didn't understand this basic concept that the conventional fiscal policy is completely irrelevant in a lockdown. And this saving to buy essential. So if there's no income, no profits, no wages, you have to draw down your savings, and the only thing you can buy is essential goods, and by nature they are essential, so we will buy them. And therefore, those without accumulated saving needed support, and government, NGOs, and even individuals, when individuals gave half pay, in the small sector, etc., in a way you can think of it as charitable or participation in helping those in a pandemic. Because logically and legally, there was no production by fiat. Lockdown was imposed by government. And so they had no right to actually force people to pay because you're forcing them to shut down. Okay, so economy 60% completely shut. Just to remind you, March 10 days was shut, whole of April, May 2 weeks, and then it gradually started opening. So if we look at the GDP, the pandemic suggests GDP be minus 25% down, actually 3.5. What do I mean by pandemic arithmetic? This is a second important point I want to convey, that you could just, by using the numbers we have given, 40%, 10%, 15%, calculate in Q1, GDP would fall by this amount. Didn't require any fancy math. So this is what I mean. People were still applying their fancy economics and math without understanding that lockdown means there is shutdown. Okay, by order. Of course, there's some evasion, there is some confusion. That, of course, in the real world, everything is there. But the simple analysis would have told you that GDP will be down by minus 25% in Q1. Unemployment rate. This is an interesting data which tells you the pattern. Okay, again, I'm using the same ratios. I'm taking the unemployment rate from CMIE and creating a ratio for each month divided by the unemployment rate in the previous year, the same month. And look at this, very interesting. Pre-lockdown in February, the unemployment rate is only marginally higher, 1.1, let's say, over the previous February. Then what happens? Suddenly you have a pandemic exploding across the world. Everybody is scared. You have a lockdown, and the unemployment goes to 1.3 times, 3.2 times, 3.3 times. The rate jumps hugely. And that's not surprising because, like I told you earlier, 45% of employment was effectively shut down. Even if some people, were giving them, because I know several small people, for example, the health sector, etc. Even though it was operating at less capacity, many people were paying partially or fully to the employees. So, but the unemployment rate jumps, and then you see in June it falls right back. This is the interesting point, the important point here, fourth point I want to make. And in July and August, it's down to the same as it was last year. Okay, so in this sense of unemployment rate, we are kind of back to normal, except we have a lower LFP, that is the labor force participation rate is down. Okay, and this is again links to what I said earlier. This is fears of pandemic. Some of this will be corrected gradually, but that fear factor has to be addressed, which is why I spent 2 minutes on telling you what will need to be done. Okay, it's very, very important. And whether they are friends, people in business, you must tell them that it's very, very important to do those things. Otherwise, we will not have a smooth and good recovery. So during this lockdown economy, given the analysis which I have very broadly told you, the job of the government was twofold. Government means both central and governments minimize mass bankruptcy. With 60% or at least 50% willfully shut, the other 10% would have been down in any case. With 50% shut, manufacturing, mining, construction, and related stuff, and no employment, no income, no profits, all losses. Okay, mass bankruptcy could have occurred. We have managed that reasonably well with monetary and fiscal coordination, and of course, ensure basic needs. Like I told you, people who didn't have savings had no money to buy food even. So again, with the programs done by the central state governments, NGOs, etc., this has we really, despite the big fuss made about the migrants and all, which is a different problem. I can go into in the questions. I won't say more now. Despite that, we managed reasonably well. I have not actually come across any, information, information on people, not having enough to eat. Okay, so then we go to the transition to normality. The logistics supply chains were clearly disrupted, and this is partly why some of even the essential commodities were not being supplied. And how do I know this? If you look at the food WPI for Q1, it approximately increased by 4%, while the food CPI increased by 10%. And the ratio of the consumer price index to wholesale price index jumped. It is at the highest level I have seen in the current series. What that means is that logistic, between the wholesale level and the final retail level, there was a gap. The costs and difficulties went up. And so lockdowns across states are partially responsible because they have increased uncertainty. And this is shown by the VIX. Again, I'll point out one number. I have the series of VIX here. VIX is the index of uncertainty on the stock exchange. And you can see in February it was 15, then it jumps to 53, okay, and then gradually comes down to 21 by August, okay, almost back to the February level. So 53, it's not been for a long, long. Last time it was there was during the financial crisis days. Market segmentation, because of the logistics supply chain disruption, we are basically what in the transition from lockdown to a normal economy, things are disrupted. There are supply chain problems, and so you get excess supply and excess demand. So what I said, that is not only a supply or a demand shock. Now it is changing because of the way that lockdown has been lifted, and it's not just in India, in all big countries like USA, etc. You have this problem. You get pockets of excess supply demand, so you can't do the simple, usual aggregate policies. Worst effective industries. What I do now is I look at the IIP for. I got to speed up. I guess I'm. So I look at the worst affected industries, and I looked at these ratios, and what we find is, now I won't give you the numbers. I leave it in the thing presentation. Maybe you can see later. So the worst affected industries are textiles and wearing apparel, transport equipment and motor vehicles, and consumer durables, among which electric goods like metal products and other the miscellaneous category of so. So if we are to do anything, and of course capital goods and construction, that's not a consumer good, so I put it separately, and something government has to do even in the transition. So transition policy, I'm relating back to what I said about the COVID and how those places, masks, these are the 5 things which are absolutely essential for government to understand, for employers, employees, and consumers to understand that mask, face cover, hygiene, hand washing, distancing, these are things we are going to need for many, many months, perhaps a year, if we really want to control it without a lot of cases and deaths. And then ventilation, which is a larger scale, which individuals cannot do, but organization has to do, to pay a lot of attention to ventilation, air cleaning of AC thing, and TTQ, what I call for summary, testing, tracing, and quarantine. This is a point I made, that the TTQ means that there's a chain. There's no point if you do, like they say, the strength of the chain depends on the weakest link. So if you miss out on quality on any of these, then that destroys the whole chain. So if you do a lot of good testing, it is no good if you don't trace it or if you don't quarantine properly and so on, right? So here I'll make the general point that countries, what we are increasingly learning is that lockdown succeeded initially wherever in various categories of lockdown always worked, because initially it had the effect of doing some of these things. But on a sustainable basis, the countries which have succeeded, whether they did lockdown or didn't do lockdown, are those which did this collection of things well. And this is the thing when I was telling you, propagate it, note it, and please tell everybody you meet. This is the only way we are going to recover quickly. Okay. Now, monetary fiscal. So, what do we need to do? We need to continue monetary fiscal coordination, which is critical and which has been pretty good. Monetary policy, maintain liquidity, stable real rates. The RBI has done a reasonably good job so far, but it still needs to focus. They seem to be wandering off again. Directed credit, risk minimization through credit guarantees, which the government did, was exactly the right thing to do, which I had been recommending well before they did it. Sector specific stimulus, you recall what I said about the thing. So textile, import tariffs, a change from specific to ad valorem duties. I'm just giving you a flavor of the kind of things which need to be done to revive demand for the sectors I mentioned earlier. GST, we need a uniform 15% tax on cotton and man-made textiles. We've always, for some crazy reason, we have always said man-made textiles are luxury goods. This is such a crazy idea, because all over the world, man-made textiles were cheaper and the poor used to buy them. The rich buy cotton. It's superior. It's more expensive. Anyway, GST reduced for some of these other ones, commercial vehicle, consumer durables, capital goods, etc. Then the further on normalization, direct cash transfers. We have been recommending from long time. This is an ideal situation to switch over all subsidies, individual subsidies, convert to direct cash transfers. There are still problems wherever there are problems. If you have this in place, we've already wasted 4 months. Aadhaar link mobile wallet to rural and migrants. If we had had this, 3 months ago, we wouldn't have had the migrant problem, because you could have given the transfers straight to their pocket, into their wallet, into their mobile phone. And if you have seen pictures of these people, all of them had one mobile phone at least. Skills Apprenticeship Act. One of the results of that CMI data is that the loss of jobs is pretty high in the formal sector, not the informal. Okay, because they can just go back to work. The self-employed on the streets, etc. So Skills Apprenticeship Act. Government infrastructure and housing, government is, I think, aware of this, and this has to be accelerated and speeded up. Then they have announced a strategic industry policy that must be made formalized and approved quickly. And as part of that, privatization and land sale must be expedited. Then supply chains to promote FDI and exports, SEZ law. I forget now, 20 years ago, I was member secretary of a committee which had recommended a special SEZ law to make labor employment and hiring, firing flexible and EODB regulations. It can still be done. This is the golden opportunity to attract supply chains from China and elsewhere, and this we should do. Second, we must pursue a policy of import substitution with China. There are already 2 or 3 initiatives. One is a production linked incentives. There is a supply chain reliability or something to that effect, resilience initiative, and targeted. Generalized tariffs are not good. Targeted on consumer goods where China monopolizes, one should keep high, the rest one should reduce, because they are needed for supply chain, and you want to attract supply chain. Then electricity cross-tax subsidy needs to be eliminated. On chemical pollution, we need common treatment facilities. So again, I'm giving you a favor of some of the policies, rationalize and simplify the GST and direct tax code. And these should be in place so that when they get back to that one, remember all those ratios, normalization would be defined if almost all those numbers were one, go back to one. And I expect that to happen by the last quarter of this year. And so if these and other policies which one has recommended, if they are in place effective 1st April, then we'll see. And finally, let's see how much, I have a little bit of time, I think. 10 minutes, let me take a little bit of time. Okay, so these are some of the trends which we can exploit and, and set the economy back on the higher growth path effective from next year. The deglobalization has been going on since the global financial crisis, but this is going to accelerate. So some of the things I already mentioned come into play. But the other big thing is the movement of people is being restricted. Visas, what you think of H-1B visas, etc. But this new trend of remote working can be a huge benefit for India, because we don't need to go to USA or Europe. That work can now increasingly, because everybody is accepted that remote working that could be done from India. High-tech decoupling. President Trump has set this in motion. This is going to accelerate. So we should look for opportunities in value chains. Similarly, export supply chain diversification from China. Again, President Trump is put this in motion. I have more information on this, but because of shortage of time, I won't go into detail. But this also is something which is potentially beneficial for us. Digitization. Huge boom is likely. It was already happening. Digitization was happening all over the world. We were a little slow. I think we are going to now rapidly catch up. And particularly, there's a great opportunity. Of course, web-based e-commerce and governance will catch up. We have been doing governance pretty much, but we've been lagging in e-learning, education, skilling, and e-health. This is a great opportunity for us. I know I hear about many Indian companies which are really, getting into it and exploiting it. Startups, environment, solar power and electric vehicles. Again, renewed understanding and of this, and public health, of course. The some of the things I mentioned before, but sewage, sanitation, hygiene need to be included in the Swachh Bharat campaign. It's going to be a big issue. Pharma and drugs, of course, we are set up to exploit. We have a comparative advantage, and we can gain from transfer of API. And of course, we are the leaders in vaccine production. So, in conclusion, Indian economy has been set by a series of events. GDP growth in FY20 was 4.2%. This is the lowest since the global financial crisis, which was around 3.8, if I remember correctly. And GDP growth FY21, I think I am among my forecast is -5%, plus minus 2.5%. But now they are increasingly more focused of minus 10% coming out of various people. Now, there's a saying we used to have, crisis is a terrible thing to waste. So structural crisis, the question is the structural crisis is a crisis or an opportunity? The pessimistic view is that growth will not only be minus 10% this year, but it may be negative or zero for the next year. More optimistic view is that growth takeoff is possible in FY 2020 if all pending reforms, which are now quite well known to the government, are in place by April 1, 2020. April 1 is important because it's better to do it now when things are all in turmoil. For example, tax reform. Given that tax revenues is so low now, a new system is not going to disrupt anything this year. So if you work it out, announce it before in the budget or earlier, then companies will be set to be able to exploit it from next year. And of course, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. Some of the trends I've mentioned are unprecedented and new, and we are well placed to exploit it. So let's see whether the pessimistic view or the optimistic view which I have prevailed. Thank you.
Dr. Virmani, this was an excellent discussion that we have had today. I'm requesting everybody who has questions to please raise hand, and our host, Mr. Vivek, will focus on you and you can ask the question. But I have two questions just to start the discussion. As you said in your previous slide, crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And given your vast experience that you have had, both at the helm of affairs within the country as well as in the International Monetary Fund. So I have a question for each segment. In the situation that we are in today, would you recommend monetization of deficit? I'm sure you were at the key positions in 93 and 97 when supplemental agreements were signed with the government of India to stop monetization of deficit. Is the situation so grim that the government should resort to that? That's my one question, and I'll be brief with the second one. The second one is, as you said, crisis is a terrible thing to waste. In 1991, we had a crisis and we turned around the economy, and you were at that time at key positions yourself. In this global crisis where the world has become flat, is it time to rethink about the international financial architecture? Thank you.
Okay, so let me start with the first question, monetization. Answer is actually simply and unambiguously yes. But let me explain. I think it's important to understand. See, with a negative, like I said, the lowest growth rate we've had is 4.2. Now we are talking about a minus 5%, or at least I am, other people are talking minus 10. So there is a massive reduction in tax revenues. This is what we call an automatic stabilizer. That means GDP fluctuates, tax revenues fluctuate with it, but it's worse in this situation because the biggest hit has been taken by the non-essential commodities. By definition, almost, the essential commodity sector is actually very lightly taxed. So, if we think of buoyancy of one, just for the sake of argument, actually the decline from a -5% GDP will be greater than -5 because most of the shutdown occurred in the non-essential sector. Okay, so this part should be unambiguously monetized. The rest should follow the usual procedures. So it's very easy. One can do a 4% product projection, which was a GDP last year, and any tax revenue fall below that reasonable projection to what actually happened, that part should be monetized. The second question you asked about the global financial architecture. Actually, after the global financial crisis, of course, we dealt with it. Yes, I was a CA at that time, and in fact, we were in Washington for the bank fund meetings, and the world was all nice and great. It was going, and I took the flight and I landed in Delhi, and I went to my office, and the whole world had collapsed. I mean, it happened while I was on the plane from Washington to Delhi. So yes, I think since then, after my term as CA expired, I was in IMF, and we did a lot of studies were done. Much of the changes in the financial structure have already been done. So I am not sure. I think the more important changes in which will follow from the pandemic is in the global health system, in our way of looking at public health, in the movement of people. So that really doesn't come strictly within the confines of IMF, but I'm sure, or I think the World Bank should be looking at some of those. I think the World Bank has a more important role than the IMF in this particular issue.
Anybody has a question, please raise the hand and we will come to you. In the meantime, I have a question from Mr. Krishnanan Tripathi, who's from ETV Bharat, and I will just read the question for you. He says he has a question on GST payment dues. Some opposition states have reportedly turned down the centre's offer that they borrow loan through a special window and it will be paid by extending the GST cess beyond the transition period of 5 years. In such a situation, how this tricky issue between states and the center can be resolved? And I think this question is especially addressed to you, given that you were in the Planning Commission, you are also heading a think tank, and then you were the chief economic advisor. The second question that he has for you is, what is your estimate for GDP growth for the full fiscal and the fiscal deficit as a percentage of the GDP?
Sorry, GDP growth, say that again.
The second question is, what is your estimate for GDP growth for the full fiscal year and fiscal deficit as a percentage of the GDP?
Okay, so GST, of course, we have done a whole paper which is in the references on GST reform, but this particular issue is not covered there. So let me answer it. Firstly, this is implicitly covered in what I said. And let me note, I don't want to get into the politics, but I want to give a sense of what the economics of the issue are. And in that sense, it's associated with what I said earlier about monetization. So the part of the revenue, which because of this pandemic-induced growth collapse, there's no other word to call it, should be actually fully monetized. So the economics of it are very clear. This actually is neither the responsibility in an economic sense. Okay, I'm not addressing the legal issues, etc. I may indirectly talk about it, but it should actually be monetized by the central bank, right? So now the question is, what is the modality of this? Now, clearly, because GST, the GST Council is a constitutional body, okay? And they have, from my understanding, they have asserted this constitutionality even with the Finance Commission. So they should also, it's not a matter of just, when you're responsible, you're also responsible for this. So formally, it seems to me, the economics of it would suggest that the GST Council should do the monetization should be done through it, and whatever payments or repayments or have to be made should come from the GST Council. As I said, I'm not talking about the legal thing. I'm just giving you the economic logic of it. Then what follows from that is, how would they be repaid by the GST Council? Well, there's a compensation cess which is to expire on June 1st, 2022. Now, I see no other way but to have a simplified and reformed compensation cess for a further number of years, purely to repay whatever economic cost is incurred through this process. What that will ensure is to have a equitable sharing of costs through the GST Council between the center and all the states, because that is the fairest mechanism I can think of. Otherwise, politically and legally, I think the only way to will be some kind of compromise between the two. But the economic part is what I have said, and that suggests that maybe legally some system can be devised which mimics what I have said is the best as far as economics is concerned. Your second question on GDP, I've already given my estimate, which is minus, I think I gave it here. Oops. Yeah, right here, GDP growth -5 to plus minus 2.5. I was just looking before the talk that Moody's, apparently, I haven't confirmed, but I saw the number, is saying there'll be a sharp rise in growth next year to minus 10.6% or something because of base effects. A lot of people forget the base effects when it comes to, they always talk about base effects when it is positive or negative, either way. But they all seem to have forgotten it now. So that is one thing. Even without that, I'll stick to my number, which I gave, -5 I gave in, I think it was end of May. It's on my Facebook authors page, and I've given my reasoning for it. Leave it there. Deficit. The only thing I would say is that if you monetize that shortfall in the thing, I think what you need as far as your expenditures is a bottoms-up approach. I think the actual deficit is irrelevant. I have said this again since we did that research on pandemic. It is in our papers. I repeat, and I think this copying of things that the West does and say, oh, they've done a fiscal boost of 100,000 million, so many trillion, I think is completely irrelevant. We have to go segment by segment and see what is needed and what is feasible. And whatever the fiscal deficit comes after monetization of the tax shortfall, I think will be the best thing to do.
Questions, and I'm going to read them to you.
Mm-hmm.
One of it is from Kanaga Sabapati.
Mm-hmm.
And his question is, if you want to dwell something on the agriculture sector.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's take a few more. If there's any more. Okay, let me do it.
This is by Professor Jenna, that
Huh?
he thinks that why did the 20 lakh package really not succeed, 20 lakh crore package not succeed? That
Okay.
is the question from Mr. Jenna.
Okay.
And then there is one question from Mr. Anand. Mr. Anand, would you like to say it
Wait,
yourself?
wait, let's
Because,
come to that. Let me do these two.
okay, sure.
So agriculture. So most of the agriculture, a large part of it is the food. I don't remember the exact number. It was something like 50 to 70% of agriculture is food and allied. Remember, milk, etc., was all open. These are food and if you talk about milk as a beverage, it will come into that food and beverage part, which was, in my view, was basically open. So, and as my numbers from both the IIP and the GDP show, that has done quite well. And given the monsoon, the liberalization on the trade account, and the other related policy measures taken by the government, the liberalization of the trade in agriculture, etc., if these bottlenecks which I mentioned with respect to CPI, which I think are being cleared, I think agriculture is going to do very well in this financial year, and I expect that the inflation which has flared up a bit, unfortunately, I think it will be controlled as soon as some of the kinks in the supply chains and the logistic chains are cleared up. On the second question, 20 crore package. Now, this relates, and it's good you asked. Some of you may have missed out in the presentation. What this is exactly the point which comes out of my analysis is that most of this package was designed for two purposes, which I have outlined there. One was to make sure that those without income, wages, workers without wages or self-employment income did not starve. Okay, so the thing about free food, etc., though, as I said, if there had been a direct cash transfer system, which can still be implemented in the next few months or next 6 months, things would have been even better. I don't think you would have had that migrant crisis at all. And secondly, because the system was shut down, there was a danger of large bankruptcies in that 60% of the system, which I told you. 10% in contact services, 50% in manufacturing, construction, and mining. And the guarantees and related things which the center put in place, which was part of this, actually has worked very, very effectively. This is what you don't understand, that if you do your guarantees of loans to the affected sector efficiently, then you will not use that money. You won't use that thing. You don't need to use it. That's the beauty of a guarantee system. And so I have not heard of mass bankruptcies in any sector, though I'm sure there have been ones which have not come to attention. So in my view, actually, it has worked very effectively. What is still a weakness, given the role of states and all, is that 5-point program which I mentioned, the health side of it. Yeah, Mr. Anand?
Yes, sir. Sir, I have a very primary question. I'm doing some work on sectoral shifts post-pandemic, in which I think I'll be guided by you. As you also have said that this post-pandemic, we are going to be more, say, remote place work and digitized. In this light, I see that the segment of the consumers which were attached here in these sectors, now they get displaced. They go to the some unskilled jobs or maybe shifting to the rural semi-urban areas. This group has a very high marginal propensity to consume. One. Second is agriculture earlier displaced the workers back to the services sector. Now the services sector is shifting to the virtual place. So, sir, do you see this possibility of the basic consumption rate falling, one. Second is the disguised unemployment, which was a thing of the past, coming back again in the rural sector.
I have a
Well,
few more. I have a few more questions lined up. Would you like to
Acha.
take, or would you like
This
to
was very
answer?
complicated. Let me just answer this
Okay,
quickly.
sure.
As far as rural and agricultural is concerned, actually, it's not been affected. The people who are there, agriculture is doing well by and large. As I said, mentioned very briefly, the indirect use of food and beverages through, let's say, hotels, restaurants, etc., has been partly affected, but part of that has been taken up by higher home consumption and part by bigger delivery. So overall, I don't see a big impact of people who live there. Some of these are migrants from urban areas which have come back, and in a way, there's better social security in rural areas, so they are also getting the job. So the actual data from CMI, he is emphasizing, I don't have that data in my computer, but what he's emphasizing is actually the formal jobs which have been lost, not the informal, not the people you think of as poor, not the vendors. They will be back on the street. The large numbers of people who were operating in trade, in dhabas, etc., all those will be back. Okay, it's the formal part which will need readjustment. So most of this, for example, automobile sector, in Q1 there was a decline across the board in automobiles. Automobiles is a huge formal sector. If this decline continues, they will not be able to afford to keep people. I've already heard reports they've cut down during the pandemic, six months, they've reduced wages to 70%, 60%, half. So it is really the formal sector, and the capacity is all there. Some of those formal sectors we will have to inject demand. Some of this is going to come by itself. So it has to be watched very carefully. So I don't really, at this stage, I think it's too much uncertainty. I don't agree with people who are, except for the trends. The trends which you see on the board will continue. But beyond that, very detailed kind of prescriptions or projections, I don't have much faith in them. Okay, Charan, now we can take a whole bunch of questions if you want.
Professor Meenakshi Rajiv from ISEC Bangalore has a question. Professor, can you say it yourself?
Yeah. You hear me?
Yes, you are audible.
So my question, it is a very thought-provoking lecture. My question is, you have talked about certain opportunities which are well taken, but then some of these opportunities to take, of course, you need skill, but there is this large section of unskilled people who have actually lost their job and gone back, migrants, and I have done some primary survey, and for example, in Northeast, they come back very soon. A place of work. I have done some survey, and also some of these traders kind of people you are saying that they are on the road, they are also having very low business, and they say we have to shut down our business if this continues. So the whole thing depends on how well we control the disease itself. Because if the disease are soaring, then people are not coming out so much to eat out or things like that. So, so what do you think? How long it will take for all these sections of people at least come back to near pre-COVID situation? So basically, I'm talking about the question of inclusive growth scenario. What we?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So. Well, I think, obviously when you have a minus 25%, let me just take approximate number, decline in GDP, there are going to be lots of people who are suffering. I don't think what my analysis doesn't show that any, particular segment of the population or industry or has suffered disproportionately. So I'm sure what you're saying that you're found from research is true, but I can only give you a macro perspective because I have to look at the overall picture. So clearly, what that is showing is that at least in the data, and this is not government data, by the way, this is CMI, which has been criticized by many pro-government people. So it's not a government view at all. Okay, that data is showing that the problem is not so much in the informal sector and more in the formal sector. That doesn't mean there is no problem in the informal sector. Now, obviously, if a normalization occurs, as I said, my judgment is, and again, there is no perfect forecast of this. It's highly uncertain. Everywhere in the world, people are running against this uncertainty. My judgment is that the economy will be more or less back to normal by the end of the year, i.e., that means the fourth quarter of the financial year. So some of the things which I think are necessary before that happens, I have mentioned, and I will repeat that. Wait a minute, 1 second. Oops. Yeah, I think the simplest and the most effective way of reaching, because again, I have realized that the problem is to identify those people who are suffering the most, who don't have fund savings to fall back on. And the only way to get it is to have a database of Aadhaar linked database for direct cash transfers. And it is not so difficult. Now, a lot of these people could just be called in. I had suggested this in May. If center and state governments had made the effort, then I can guarantee you that by May, June, July, August, 4 months, definitely we were at it. And we would have been able to reach exactly those people you're talking about. The ones you actually interview, we would have been able to get them the cash so that they continue to survive and do, survive till the economy picks up in 6 months or whenever. Next question?
Yeah,
good evening.
Who's this? Is
Good
that
evening,
Hira?
Mr. Yeah, can I ask my question
Yeah,
here?
please go ahead.
Yeah, please. Good, Mr. Virmani, it is very good, good going. We are totally appreciating what you are telling. Hello, am I audible
Yeah,
here?
please.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. See, I'm a assistant professor from Venkateshwara College, Delhi University. See, my question is, I'm not a fancy economist here. I'm a completely optimistic one. I'm a practical economist. So as you told, the fiscal stimulation and all, won't you feel that this fiscal stimulation, one way it could create a problem of your subsidy trap, or the problem of it will be adding the fuel of your inflationary trap? So how we are going to make a strategical measure if you want to make this the fiscal stimulation? Because I don't want to see how I want to make these these kind of subsidies to my people. At the same time, I want to be aware of these two things. I don't want to put them again and again in the problem of inflationary trap one side. On the other side, I want to make I don't want my people be in that the subsidy trap. So do you have any strategical measures to avoid these problems, Mr. Arvind?
So, connected to this question, Dr. Virmani, is a question from Jammu, which here is a question from Jammu. This is Mr. Raghav Sharma, who says that related to this, that's why I intervened, reducing subsidies on fertilizers, water and energy consumption can create fiscal space, also lead to less exploitation of natural resources. So he wanted your view that once more fiscal space is created, we could use the same fiscal space for other things. Other than these questions, there are 3 more questions waiting. Should I tell them now, or would you like to take them after?
No, please wait. Let me do this because this is an important fiscal question which keeps coming up again and again. Okay. So firstly, on subsidies, let me be very clear. The stuff which I have on direct cash transfers, I didn't explain because we were running out of time. What I am actually proposing is that all subsidies into one pool and converted to direct cash transfers. So there is no additional permanent loss or fiscal negative fiscal impact of the kind you are rightly afraid of, either through inflation or other reasons. So as far as that issue is concerned, my proposal should be reassuring to you. The second thing I'd just like to point out is that during the pandemic, though wages were being paid to government servants who work in offices, projects and programs were actually shut down. They were part of that non-essential, essential goods. I told you what they are. The projects and programs were not inside that. So you were not actually spending money during that period. The problem now, which I am saying, is to your infrastructure and housing expenditure are already budgeted. I'm not talking about new things. We are in September. We have half a year left. All I'm saying is now please hurry up, because this is the time when whatever little, construction is in terrible shape. Investment is down hugely. And so I am saying the government should speed up the expenditure on these items. Finally, the question of more, and the third thing I'm saying is that a very important policy on defining strategic sectors is concerned, which will give infinite clarity on privatization issues. Again, I am saying please do that quickly and then start the sale of whatever companies are not strategic, selling of land, etc., whatever is there, start doing that urgently. So again, I am not proposing huge, big new programs. I am very specific, very focused, and there are 2 or 3 GST suggestions which you may have missed. But those are part of an overall reform plan, which I have again mentioned in one of the slides. They are not mentioned in the same place. Those numbers are from that comprehensive reform that we have proposed. And again, you can read that in our paper. So asset sales will have to be pushed up, and I am suggesting how to do it.
Should I?
Sir, I have a question. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure. There are 4 questions now. I'm just going to say that. Yes.
Charan, this is Ashok.
Yeah, we will. You want to ask your question?
Yes, Charan.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Sir, this was an excellent presentation and it was very, very, very enlightening. My simple question is, because of the lockdown, all ports are closed. So what will be the contribution of our exports, or for that matter import? You were talking about the import substitution, how this will play out. The factor of ports being closed are working under very, very minimal capacity.
Sharon, should we now take all the questions and then I'll answer, starting with Dr. Vishen Das?
Okay, there is a question by Pushan who says, which industry, according to you, can help the recovery for a country of India's size? Then there is a question by Sangram. He has a question: government's policy on FDI and Atmanirbhar. And then there is a question which I want Hira to ask. Hira, can you please ask your question yourself?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So my question is, for the past 1 year, the Monetary Policy Committee has been consistent in reducing the repo rate in every subsequent meeting. But in the previous last one held in August, it maintained the status quo and did not reduce the repo rate any further. So what, according to you, should be the stance in the upcoming months, that is in October, that is in September and October? Should it reduce the repo rate further because the economic growth has not been achieved to the extent which was desired, or should it be increased so as to prevent inflation from occurring any further?
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we will close with the set of questions. Your response.
Okay. So Dr. Vishen Das talks about ports being closed. I am sure they were closed in the lockdown. Everything was closed, right? But I'm not fully aware of how the situation has evolved since then. If we look at the trade data, both exports and imports are down, they are taking place. So my expectation is that after May, in June, July, August, and now September, they have gradually actually gone back to normal, because anyway, the export growth is down. So one doesn't have to operate at, kind of 100% incremental capacity. So my guess would be that they are back adequately, given that both export and import growth is slow. So I really don't see a bottleneck on the port side. But now that you have mentioned it, I will certainly check it out. I have not heard anything so far about that being a bottleneck to trade. That's all I can say. I don't have any more information. Now, as far as the related issue of import substitution, Atmanirbhar, global for local, I think there were, when Make in India was announced, there were a lot of doubts, and then several increases in tariff rates further accentuated the doubts. But I think now gradually the policy of the government is becoming clearer. I think they are fully aware that a policy of permanent import substitution would be a disaster. You cannot replicate the disastrous experience of the Indira Gandhi government, where they kept restricting and banning things one on the other. It's a chain which leads to disaster. So I think they have clarified that these will be temporary measures. I think they are focusing now on providing, for example, take a case in which a supply chain producer from China wants to move here. There are sunk costs. So to overcome those sunk costs, India has introduced what is called a production. If you move your plant here, you lose some money by that movement, but then you get an incentive here. So compensating for the real cost is better than permanently protecting an industry, though government has clarified there may be some temporary protection, but it won't last forever. Hopefully it'll be phased out over 3 to 5 years. That is one aspect. And second is, here I'm not 100% sure, but my guess is the government will move toward that. This is what I think they should do. I think import substitution is needed and will be a good thing vis-a-vis China. But for the rest of the world, we must pursue the traditional open policy in which we welcome and we do not keep raising tariffs. In fact, we should do FTAs with the countries which are the movers and shakers of the supply chain, like US and EU. And I hope something is being thought of along those lines, an FTA with these two groups. The third issue is on FDI policy. I think our FDI policy has made big strides. That is actually one of the reforms during the last 6 months or so, 6 years or so, which is less remarked on than it should. And the defense policy is just one example. More recently in space and atomic energy, everything are opening up private competition. The key is not foreign or domestic. The key is competition. This is what many people do not focus on again. We always think it's us versus them. The issue is the country as a whole benefits if there is more intense competition. Okay? And of course, competition means against countries and companies which act competitively. I mean, if you're fighting against monopolies, then perhaps other measures have to be taken, which is what I suggested vis-a-vis China. Finally, on monetary policy, the repo rate. I think the key thing here is judgment about the spike in inflation rates. Now, because if you remember during period April, May, June, it's really the food and related sectors which were open. Okay. Now, if those are driving the inflation rate, there is a cause to be concerned. The difference is that in my analysis, I link it imperfect logistic chains being disrupted by the pandemic and by supply chain disruptions. I think those are getting corrected and will get corrected by the end of September because they are from some of the supply chain disruptions in the sector which are open more recently, like manufacturing, may take a little longer time. But the inflation on those is very low. The so-called core non-food inflation is very, very low. So if my analysis is right, then there have to be will be further repo rate reduction in the next thing once the further data comes out.
I would like to thank the audience. I'm sorry many of you were put to inconvenience. The capacity was 100 active participation, and there were many people who were sending me messages saying we can't get in. I apologize for that. There was very good response, and we are really thankful to you for the good response.
Thank you.
I want to thank Dr. Virmani for an excellent discussion. You have seen that it reflected so much of policy orientation throughout his presentation and the interaction that he has had with everybody. This will be available on the EGROW's website, and you are welcome to use it, refer to it for your students or for also other policy discussions wherever you need it. I want to make an announcement. On September 14, Monday, we have Dr. Ashok Vishandas, former chairman of Commission for Agriculture Cost and Prices, and he's also a professor. He will be speaking to us on the most important topic that is of interest to all of us, doubling farmers' income. So I'm going to request each one of you to please make sure that you join us at the same time like today, 5:30 to 6:30. We will have Dr. Professor Ashok Vishandas on 14th of September. On 18th of September, we have Dr. Ratna Sahai, who's the Deputy Director at the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C. We will tell you the convenient time that is mutually convenient for us and her. The time gap is nearly 9.5 hours. We will come to you with the time. Just watch our page and our emails. And she is going to be talking on fintech and financial inclusion. So 2 announcements. September 14, doubling farmers' income. September 18, fintech and financial inclusion. Please look out for these, and we'll be happy to again host you for our webinar. Our webinar series will be always announced on our website. Feel free to tap on them. And once again, let me thank each one of you for your time.
Thank you very much, sir.
Speaker,
Thank
Chief
you.
Guest, Dr. Virmani,
It's our
for
pleasure,
taking
sir.
time
Thank
out
you.
and
Thank you,
speaking.
sir.
Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir. It was a nice lecture.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.